America 2020, the real state of the union and the economy. Hi, I'm Dave Okenquist, and that's the theme of next month's Irrational Economic Summit taking place in Washington, D.C. Joining me is one of the presenters, Mr. David Stockman. David, good to talk to you this morning.
Happy to be with you.
Yeah, I haven't talked to you since last year's Irrational Economic Summit, and it's great to reconnect with you this year. And those who don't know David Stockman, he's a former congressman, the former budget director under President Reagan, a best-selling author of many books, and he's also the author of the Stockman Letter. So lots of things under your belt, David. It's good to talk to you and get your expertise. I'd like to start with sort of where are we in terms of the economic landscape? Things have changed a bit since last year. Looks like the Fed went from tightening to loosening, sort of changing course. Of course, a little bit under pressure by the president. All that also is going on is the trade war with China and the election next year. So what do you make of what's going on?
Well, I would say we're in uncharted waters. Washington has broken all the rules. There used to be such a thing as a real interest rate. There used to be such a notion that savers were entitled to a return, as well as the rates that borrowers face. All of that has been thrown out the window when the Fed pivoted, after December. We actually went 127 months in which the money market or federal funds rate was below the inflation rate. In real terms, that means money was free or actually negative. It didn't do any good for Main Street, but it helped speculators on Wall Street like there was no tomorrow. So that they've already pivoted and they're beginning to cut rates when the unemployment rate is 3.7%, when we're at month 121 of the longest business expansion in history, is just incredible. It's a measure of how far off base we are. Now, of course, they're getting a lot of heat, not just from Wall Street. They're always begging for more easy money, for more juice from the Fed. But Trump is all over their case as well, and he's now demanding zero interest rates so that it doesn't cost anything for Uncle Sam to fund the massive debt that Trump is only making worse with his big spending for defense and his compromises with the Democrats to get defense. He's giving them all the domestic spending they want. So we're heading into a real mess. We have had this so-called crisis in 08 and 09. We've had 10 years of tepid recovery to try to fix things. They've fixed nothing. The deficit is at the highest level relative to GDP in history at this time of the cycle. The Fed is completely lost. And we have a wild man in the Oval Office who basically wants to start a trade war with the world and an easy money war with his own central bank. So hang on to your seat. None of the rules apply anymore. This is a very dangerous time to be in the markets. People have to be there. They have to earn a return on their, investable funds. But it will take more care, prudence, and attention than ever before.
David, you mentioned the trade war. You said Trump starting possibly with the entire world. It seems to be one of the hammers that he has, and everything looks like a nail. So, what are your thoughts on his action towards China? Of course, he's also threatened to the EU and used those threats to Mexico as well to get some sort of help on the border. But what are your general philosophy? Are you a free trade guy? Do you lean somewhat protection, or where are you?
No, I'm free trade. Obviously, if you believe in small government and free markets, you don't believe in a big trade nanny in Washington running the whole import-export sector. We have about $4.5 trillion worth of commerce from the world. And let me tell you, these clowns in Washington have no idea of, who's cheating and who isn't. And all the rest of it. This is the worst turn in trade since the 1930s. It's kind of Hooverite, Smoot-Hawley all over again. Yes, we have a huge trade deficit that needs to be remedied, but that's because we've got too much domestic inflation and our costs are too high because the Fed has this crazy notion that we're better off with 2% inflation when we're in a world where wages, say in China, are $5 an hour fully loaded. Here they're 30. So how can we compete if the Fed wants to keep driving inflation rate and costs and wages and prices in America higher? So Trump has it upside down. The real enemy is in the Eccles building. He is attacking the Fed, but from the left side of the spectrum, when actually we should be focusing on sound money, zero inflation, and getting the Fed out of the financial markets.
Now, you mentioned the clowns in Washington, and of course, we have an election next year. Are there any non-clowns that might have a chance? Maybe some jugglers or someone to step above?
Good question. Would that there were. I don't see any. I think it's pretty evident, though, that we're drifting into a very bad situation for 2020 and beyond. Trump has embraced this huge stock market bubble. I think it's going to collapse before 2020. He's bragging about an economy that essentially is nearing its old age sell-by date. We're going to have a recession next year or so. He's done nothing to help the economy. The tax cut was paid for by Uncle Sam's credit card. Most of it's gone into stock buybacks into the 1%. It hasn't helped Main Street. So we're going to end up on the Democrat side with Elizabeth Warren, who is a, out and out redistributionist populist who's going to go after the 1% and the 0.1%. And it's going to be very appealing to a country that will suddenly wake up and find out that 10 years of lies and of fantasy have now ended. We didn't recover. We didn't fix anything. We just deferred the day of reckoning after the wake-up call in 2008 or 2009. So when she comes in and says there's 50,000 or 100,000 billionaires who need to pay more, the public's going to respond to that. And so we're facing a very dangerous time, because if we have a Fed that's out of control, we have central banks around the world that are basically wrecking the bond market. They've destroyed, honest price discovery, and then we get someone heading for the Oval Office, or even a serious contender who wants to implement these kinds of redistributionist policies. I think we're going to really have a disaster on our hands.
Yeah, great points. David, I want to go back to something you mentioned just a little bit earlier regarding deficits. I know as a former budget director, news came out a couple of weeks ago from the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, that said the United States had a $960 billion fiscal deficit for 2019, and it doesn't get better from there. For counting next year through 2029, the CBO estimates that there will be deficits of $1.2 trillion each and every single year. What do you make of this ballooning deficit problem? Is there a way out of it?
Well, it's the biggest problem we're facing, because not only are these numbers huge, but they're coming at the top of a business cycle that's the longest business expansion in history. Now, even the Keynesians back in the 60s and 70s, who were big deficit spenders and stimulus people, agreed that when the economy gets healthy and you got full employment and you're at the top of a business cycle, you got to rein it in. You should maybe even have a surplus. And here we are now with the largest deficits in history, 5% of GDP at the top of the cycle. And Trump's fiscal policy, because he wants so much defense, he's had to pay for it with 60, 70 billion a year of additional domestic spending. They haven't touched entitlements whatsoever. They have ballooned the deficit like never before. So here we go into the 2020s at the top of a business cycle, with the deficit widening by the day, and we're going to have 10,000 new people retiring every day as the baby boom hits 68 and beyond. So you couldn't imagine a more perfect storm, fiscal storm, than a recession, which is guaranteed. Nobody's outlawed it. The baby boom wave retiring, and Washington either in complete paralysis fiscally, or in the hands of a populist, leftist Democratic government that wants Medicare for all and free college tuition for everybody, And then, Elizabeth Warren, who I think will be the nominee, wants to shut down the entire shale industry, the only thing that we really have going today in terms of more robust levels of growth. So the fiscal equation has never been worse. And I see nothing that's going to change it, at least until we have a real crisis and the rascals are thrown out and we start all over again if we possibly can.
Well, it sounds like then that that $1.2 trillion figure might maybe be an underestimate of what could happen.
Oh, it's far an underestimate because that CBO forecast that you just cited through 2029 assumes there won't be a recession until the end of the next decade. That would mean that we would have gone roughly 22 years without a recession. I mean, that's never happened. It's not even remotely, possible by all historic standards. We will have a recession, and when you factor in a recession, and also when you realize that CBO under congressional dictates is forced to assume that a lot of spending cuts will be made that are projected in the out-year budget that won't be,
Right.
or that revenue increases will happen that they keep deferring as you get closer to the effective date. If you adjust for all that, we have 20 trillion of new deficits over the next 10 years based on realistic economics, not rosy scenario, but at least one recession, and an honest accounting for what's built in on the tax and spending side. Now, therefore, people think we have a $22 trillion national debt. Objectively, it's 42 trillion because that 20 trillion, is built in, is baked into the cake. It's coming at us, and I see no, propensity whatsoever in the political system to do anything about it. And, that puts us kind of in the Greek category. That's 140, 150%
Right.
debt to GDP. And you really can't expect the economy to prosper when you have that kind of government debt burden bearing down on the system.
Absolutely. David, I also want to talk about your most recent book, Peak Trump, The Undrainable Swamp and the Fantasy of MAGA. Talk a little bit about that, and for readers who are interested, what they can sort of expect in those contents.
Well, he had the right idea. He wanted to drain the swamp. He got down there and embraced the swamp. Trump is the biggest spending president in American history. And that's no exaggeration. If you look at apples to apples dollars, in other words, 2019 purchasing power,
Right.
Trump has increased the budget in the 4 budgets that he's now responsible for by, 180 billion a year. I mean, we thought George Bush the younger was bad at 120. You thought Obama was bad. His grew at 75 billion a year, and Bill Clinton at 40 billion. So, Trump is in a league all of his own, and I'm talking apples to apples here, constant dollars, current purchasing power. And when you have a Republican president just running up spending at that kind of rate, and I'll repeat it again, 185 billion a year in real dollars, and then cutting taxes on top of that, you're just asking for massive fiscal troubles.
Absolutely. I can't, I'm very interested in that book. Like to dive into that. I'm sure everyone else is also. Thank you so much for joining me, David. I'm looking forward to seeing you and your presentation at the Irrational Economic Summit. That's in Washington, D.C., October 10th through 12th at the Gaylord National. So reserve your seat now. For David Stockman, I'm Dave Okenquist, and have a great trading day.